So for now we're going to talk about something called scope. Scope is a term in programming that's used to describe how long something is in memory and where it's accessible within the program. Now typically that implies variables, but it could imply other things, methods, subprograms, which we're going to get into later on in the course, which is really the overall topic of this section of the course. Now right now what you see on the screen are two variables, one called user age and one called username. Username should be a string, not an int. Now these two variables are defined in two very different parts of the program. What I want to show you here is that a variable can have two degrees of scope. It can either have global scope or local scope, and those two things mean something very different. Global scope is when a variable is defined outside of the main subprogram or outside of any code block, but inside of the class. So here we see that username is defined inside the class. We know this because it's in between this bracket and this bracket, the opening and closing brace. What that implies is that it's actually in memory and in the Java dictionary, so to speak, until we get down to the bottom of this last bracket. Well, that's the entire program because this is our class. So at this point in our programs, they're very small. They're only in a single class. So that means that we can use username throughout the entire life of the program. Not only that, we can use it in any code block within our program, including main. Now that being said, I have to give you one reminder. If you do plan on using a global variable, which is this up here, inside of the main, because main is static, the variable must also be defined as static, just to make them compatible. If you were using it inside of another code block that we're going to get into later on that isn't static, then your variable would not need to be static. It's just for consistency's sake at this point in the course. So global variables are in memory for the entire life of the program, and they're accessible for the entire life of the program, everywhere and anywhere. That brings us to user age. User age is what's called a local variable. It's a variable that's defined within a code block, in this case the main code block. So what that means is that it's only in memory until we get to the last closing bracket of that code block. So when that closing bracket is executed, this variable is deleted. It's removed from memory, it's removed from the Java dictionary, it doesn't exist. So it cannot be used outside. So if we had another code block below here, it would not even know that user age exists or ever had existed. It is only usable within that code block. So this is a very powerful tool because it does allow us to free up certain memory. But it does create some problems depending on the type of program you're building. So the question is, when do you use global and when do you use local? The benefit of using local variables is that the memory is freed up after the code block is complete, allowing the data to be stored, or allowing the data to be used again by something else within the program or another program altogether. That memory is now free for anything. The benefit of using global variables is that you can use the variable throughout the whole program and feel safe that that variable is usable, and you don't have to worry about maybe I deleted it, maybe I don't have it anymore, which one am I talking about? So it does create some problems. And then we get down into another idea, is that local variables, because they free up the memory, it creates that benefit of having the memory free for other programs and the program itself. However, what if you're making a game, and a game that's running at a certain frame rate? So we're running at a game, let's say 60 frames per second. That means 60 times per second. If you are creating a variable inside that loop, that means you're generating a new data location 60 times per second. That's not good. That can cause a problem. It could slow down the system depending on the size of the variable. Maybe it's an object, maybe it's a primitive, we don't know. But it could cause a problem in theory, especially if you're doing it a lot of times. So in video games, for our course and our intents and purposes, typically we're going to be working with global data so we don't run into that problem. Yes, it does take up the memory for the entire life of the program, but at the benefit of speed on the CPU. And when you're dealing with games, usually speed is your utmost priority. So the answer is, it depends. It depends on what you're doing at the time. Ideally, in our standard programs, We want all data to be local unless it absolutely has to be global. An example of a variable that may need to be global in a video game may be somebody's score. So the score may be displayed in one part of the program, it may be added to in another part of the program, it may be subtracted from in another part of the program. It all depends. So you may need to use it all over the place.